My name is Evelyn, and I am 67 years old. As a retired archivist, I spent my career meticulously preserving local histories and upholding the reputations of families and institutions throughout our community. For 35 years, I was trusted with the most sensitive documents and private family records, maintaining confidentiality while ensuring that future generations would have access to accurate historical information. I raised my daughter Sarah as a single mother after my husband's death, pouring immense love into her upbringing and later into my grandchildren, Michael and Emily, offering constant care and creating what I believed were treasured memories that would last a lifetime. I thought my devotion was clear to everyone who knew us, especially my longtime best friend and next-door neighbor Betty, who had witnessed decades of my dedication to family. Then Betty, consumed by what I would later discover was decades of unspoken resentment and jealousy, launched a vicious slander campaign that would destroy everything I held dear. She fabricated horrifying lies about my relationship with my grandchildren, claiming I neglected them when they visited me and that I was somehow using them for financial gain, inventing stories about a $20,000 allowance I supposedly received for their care. The devastation was swift and complete. Sarah, manipulated by Betty's carefully crafted lies, sent me a text message that shattered my heart. "You're a danger to them. You have no humanity left. My grandson Michael, sweet Michael, who had once called me his favorite person in the world, screamed at me during our last encounter. You're crazy. You hurt us. My integrity. My love, my life's work as both a professional archivist and devoted grandmother. All of it was maliciously twisted and destroyed by someone I had trusted completely. I felt utterly discarded, branded as a negligent grandmother by my own community, profoundly alone in a way I had never experienced, even during my darkest days of widowhood. Yet as despair threatened to consume what remained of my will to fight an archivist's unwavering drive for truth and accuracy, ignited something unexpected, a cold, determined fury. What Betty, Sarah, Michael, Emily, and their neighborhood gossip columnist didn't know was my secret weapon, decades of meticulous dated journals and detailed visitor logs that recorded every single moment my grandchildren had spent in my care, documenting not neglect, but devoted attention to their every need. More importantly, I had discreet security cameras that had been capturing Betty's suspicious activities for months, recording her conspiratorial conversations with neighbors where she explicitly made false allegations about my character and fitness as a grandmother. My forensic expert, ally someone from my professional past who specialized in document analysis and evidence preservation, waited to be called into action. This time, their insidious slander campaign wouldn't just unravel under scrutiny. It would expose Betty's malicious envy, reclaim my dignity, and restore my reputation, though at an agonizing cost that would forever change my understanding of friendship, family, and the devastating power of lies told by those we trust most. The confrontation I had been dreading came sooner than I expected, just 2 days after Sarah's devastating text message had shattered my understanding of my own family. I could no longer bear the uncertainty and the growing whispers I heard whenever I ventured outside my house, so I decided to drive to Sarah's home and demand an explanation for the horrible accusations that were destroying my reputation and my relationship with my grandchildren. Sarah's house, where I had spent countless happy hours helping with homework, preparing family dinners, and reading bedtime stories, now felt like enemy territory as I approached the front door. My hands were shaking as I rang the doorbell, and when Sarah answered, her face was a mask of cold anger that I had never seen directed toward me before. "Mom, what are you doing here?" she said, without inviting me inside her voice, carrying the kind of weary irritation usually reserved for unwanted solicitors. I thought my message was clear. We need space right now. Before I could respond, I heard Betty's familiar voice calling from inside the house. "Sarah, honey, is everything all right?" And then she appeared in the doorway, positioning herself slightly behind Sarah, like a protective guardian, her eyes meeting mine with a look of false concern that made my stomach turn. "Oh, Evelyn," Betty said with that particular tone of voice that sounded sympathetic but felt like a knife. "I'm so glad you're here. Sarah and I have been so worried about you lately. We think it might be time to have an honest conversation about what's been happening." The way she inserted herself into what should have been a private moment between mother and daughter was my first clear indication that Betty wasn't just a concerned friend offering support. She was orchestrating this entire confrontation, and Sarah was allowing her to take control of a family matter that should have had nothing to do with an outsider. "Sarah," I said, trying to focus on my daughter despite Betty's intrusive presence, "I don't understand what's happening. The things you accused me of in your text, they're not true. You know how much I love Michael and Emily. You know how carefully I watch them when they're with me." But before Sarah could respond, Betty stepped forward with the kind of authoritative confidence that suggested she had been preparing for this moment. "Evelyn, we know this is difficult to hear, but several neighbors have expressed concerns about your recent behavior with the children. Mrs. Henderson saw you leaving them alone in your backyard for over an hour last week while you were inside taking a nap." The lie was so brazen and specific that it took my breath away. I had never left my grandchildren unattended, not even for 5 minutes, and Mrs. Henderson lived 3 houses down with no clear view of my backyard. But Betty delivered the accusation with such conviction that I could see Sarah nodding along, as if this confirmed suspicions she had already been harboring. "That's not true," I said, my voice rising with the desperation of someone watching their reality being rewritten in real time. "I have never left them alone. Never. Sarah, you know me better than anyone. How can you believe I would do something like that?" But Betty wasn't finished with her performance. She placed a comforting hand on Sarah's shoulder and continued with her catalog of supposed offenses. "And there's the matter of the money, Evelyn. $20,000 a year is a lot to expect from a young mother for babysitting services, especially when you're not providing the level of care that justifies that expense." The money lie was perhaps the most devastating because it transformed my voluntary loving care for my grandchildren into a business transaction, suggesting that I was somehow exploiting Sarah financially while simultaneously providing inadequate service. I had never asked for or received a penny for watching Michael and Emily. In fact, I regularly spent my own money on activities, toys, and treats for them because their happiness was worth more to me than any amount of money. "There is no $20,000, I said, my voice breaking with the strain of defending myself against accusations that seemed to be multiplying by the minute. "I don't take money for loving my own grandchildren. Sarah, tell her, you know I've never asked you for payment." But Sarah's response revealed how completely Betty had poisoned her perception of our relationship. "Mom, I know you think you're entitled to that money because of all the time you spend with them, but Betty's right. The amount you're demanding is unreasonable, and frankly, the care you're providing doesn't justify the cost." Hearing my own daughter speak about my love for her children as if it were a commercial service that wasn't meeting her standards felt like having my heart torn out while I was still conscious. These were the children I had helped raise from infancy, whose first words had been spoken in my living room, whose scraped knees I had bandaged with kisses, and whose bedtime fears I had soothed with stories and songs. The humiliation deepened when I realized that other neighbors were gathering on the sidewalk, drawn by the raised voices and the obvious drama unfolding in Sarah's doorway. Mrs. Thompson, the woman who wrote the neighborhood gossip blog, was among them, her phone out and recording everything for what would undoubtedly become a viral post about family dysfunction and elder care issues. "Sarah, please," I begged, no longer caring who was watching this public destruction of my family relationships. "Let me show you my journals. I keep detailed records of every visit, every activity, every moment I spend with Michael and Emily. You can see for yourself that I've never neglected them or asked for money. But Betty's influence had been too thorough and too systematic for evidence to matter at this point." Sarah shook her head with the kind of sad finality that suggested this conversation was merely a formality, that decisions about my future role in the family had already been made without my input. "The decision is final, Mom," she said, stepping back into her house as if my very presence was contaminating her family's safety. "We need time to figure out what's best for the children, and right now that means keeping them away from you." The door closed with a sound that felt like a coffin lid slamming shut on my relationship with my daughter and grandchildren. I stood on the sidewalk in front of the house, where I had once been welcomed as a beloved grandmother, now branded as a dangerous stranger who posed a threat to the very children I loved more than my own life. But it was the text message I received later that evening that delivered the final blow to whatever hope I still harbored for a reasonable resolution to this nightmare. Sarah's words appeared on my phone screen like a death sentence. "Mom, I can't believe the things I'm hearing about you. You're neglecting my kids. Betty told me everything. I need to protect them. Don't contact me. You're a danger to them. You have no humanity left." Reading those words from my own daughter, seeing her complete acceptance of Betty's lies, despite decades of evidence. To the contrary, I felt something break inside me that I wasn't sure could ever be repaired. The woman who had raised Sarah as a single mother, who had sacrificed career opportunities to be present for every school play and soccer game, who had opened her home and her heart to her grandchildren without reservation, was now being told she had no humanity left. The formal letter that arrived 3 days later, sent by a lawyer named Mr. Smith on behalf of Sarah, made the situation legally binding. It demanded that I cease all contact with my daughter and grandchildren due to my unacceptable behavior and demonstrated inability to provide appropriate care. The letter threatened legal action if I attempted to visit, call, or approach my family in any way. But perhaps most devastating was the realization that Michael, my precious grandson, who had once spent every weekend at my house building model airplanes and learning to bake cookies, had been completely turned against me. When I encountered him by chance at the grocery store, his reaction was swift and cruel. "Go away, Grandma," he screamed loud enough for everyone in the store to hear. "You're mean. You hurt us. You're crazy, and you're going to get us taken away from Mommy." His words revealed that he had been taught to see me not just as neglectful, but as an active threat to his family's stability. Someone had convinced an 8-year-old boy that his grandmother, who had never raised her voice to him or denied him anything he needed, was dangerous enough to justify this level of fear and rejection. As I drove home from that encounter, my hands shaking and my vision blurred by tears I couldn't control, I began to understand that I was facing something far more sophisticated than simple family misunderstandings or temporary conflicts that could be resolved through honest conversation. This was a systematic campaign to destroy my reputation, isolate me from my family, and brand me as a dangerous person who couldn't be trusted with the safety and welfare of children. And the most terrifying aspect was that it was being orchestrated by someone I had considered my closest friend for over 20 years. Someone who knew exactly which lies would be most devastating because she knew exactly what mattered most to me. But as I sat in my empty house that evening, surrounded by photographs and mementos from decades of family gatherings that now felt like evidence of a life that was being systematically erased, I felt something stirring that I recognized from my professional training as an archivist. It was the cold, methodical determination that came when I encountered attempts to falsify historical records or distort documented truth. Betty and Sarah had made a crucial mistake. They assumed that destroying my relationships would also destroy my ability to fight back. But they had forgotten that I was a woman who had spent her entire career learning how to preserve truth in the face of those who wanted to bury it, and I had the documentation to prove every lie they had told about me. The campaign against me escalated over the following weeks with the systematic precision of someone who understood exactly how to destroy a reputation built over decades of community service and family devotion. Betty didn't just content herself with spreading lies about my care of Michael and Emily. She began attacking the very foundation of my professional credibility and personal integrity. Her new strategy was particularly insidious because it targeted my work as an archivist, suggesting that if I was capable of neglecting my own grandchildren, I might also have been capable of manipulating historical records during my career. The implications were devastating, threatening not just my current reputation, but potentially invalidating 35 years of professional work that families and institutions had depended upon. I've been thinking about some inconsistencies I noticed in local historical records over the years. Betty told a gathering at the local historical society, her voice carrying the kind of concerned authority that made people lean in to listen. Given what we're learning about Evelyn's recent behavior, I wonder if we should audit some of her past work to ensure the integrity of our community's historical documentation. The suggestion that I might have used my position to manipulate local history or cover up family secrets was a masterstroke of character assassination because it was impossible to disprove without reviewing thousands of documents, and the very act of having to defend my professional integrity suggested that there might be something worth investigating. But Betty's most devastating weapon was her ability to use my own compassionate nature against me. She began telling people that my defensive reactions to her concerns were proof of my guilt, that a truly innocent person would welcome investigation rather than becoming agitated by reasonable questions about child welfare. I'm worried about Evelyn's mental state, she confided to Mrs. Patterson, the president of the Historical Society, during what she thought was a private conversation, but which I overheard from the next aisle at the grocery store. She's become so paranoid and accusatory whenever anyone asks reasonable questions about her care of those children. It's like she's completely lost touch with reality. The poison of her words spread through our small community with the efficiency of a carefully planned public relations campaign. Betty had identified the most influential gossips and community leaders, feeding each of them slightly different versions of the same basic narrative, that I was an unstable elderly woman whose mental decline was making me dangerous to children and unreliable as a source of accurate information about anything. But it was when I discovered Betty's online activity that I finally understood the true scope of her malice and the depth of her long-hidden resentment toward me. Using skills I had developed during my archival work with digital records, I managed to trace several anonymous comments on Mrs. Thompson's neighborhood blog back to Betty's computer IP address. The comments revealed a level of viciousness that took my breath away. The old bat finally got what was coming to her. She thought she was so special with her perfect family and her important job at the Historical Society. Now everyone knows the truth about what kind of person she really is. Justice for neglected kids. Reading those words, seeing the cruel satisfaction Betty took in my destruction, I finally understood that this wasn't about protecting Michael and Emily or ensuring proper child care. This was about decades of accumulated envy and resentment that had been festering beneath the surface of our friendship, waiting for the right moment to explode into devastating revenge. The chilling clarity of that realization forced me to confront an even more painful truth about the relationship I thought we had shared. Betty hadn't been acting out of sudden concern for my grandchildren. She had been systematically collecting information about my family life for years, waiting for an opportunity to weaponize my love for Michael and Emily against me. But it was in that moment of devastating understanding that another memory surfaced, one so painful I had buried it deep in my consciousness because it represented the ultimate betrayal of the friendship I had thought was genuine. Betty's current campaign of destruction wasn't the first time she had asked me to sacrifice my integrity for her benefit. It was just the first time I had recognized it for what it was. 20 years earlier, Betty had faced what could have been the complete destruction of her life and reputation. Her gambling addiction, which she had hidden from everyone, including her own family, had spiraled completely out of control, leaving her with over $75,000 in debt to dangerous people who were beginning to make threats about her physical safety. But the gambling debts were just the beginning of her problems. As treasurer of the local children's charity, where she volunteered, Betty had begun borrowing money from the organization's accounts to cover her losses, telling herself she would replace it before anyone noticed. By the time she came to me for help, she was facing potential embezzlement charges that would have sent her to prison and destroyed her family's standing in the community. I had used my entire retirement savings, over $50,000, that I had been setting aside for my golden years to help pay off her debts and keep her out of prison. But more damaging to my own integrity, I had used my skills as an archivist and my access to historical documents to create a false paper trail that shifted blame for the missing charity funds to a former employee who had already moved out of state. The process had required me to falsify dates on financial records, create backdated correspondence, and even plant forged documents in archived files to support the narrative that would save Betty from criminal prosecution. I had compromised every ethical principle I had spent my career upholding, but I had done it willingly because I believed Betty was genuinely remorseful and that our friendship was worth the sacrifice. Throughout the entire ordeal, Betty had sworn that she would never forget what I had done for her, that she would spend the rest of her life proving herself worthy of my friendship and trying to repay the debt she owed me. She had cried in my kitchen, holding my hands and promising that this would be a turning point in her life, that she would never again put me in a position where I had to choose between my integrity and her welfare. Now, 20 years later, that same woman was systematically destroying my reputation and my family relationships, using her intimate knowledge of my character and my vulnerabilities to inflict maximum damage on everything I held dear. The cosmic irony was unbearable. The person whose life I had saved through deception was now using deception to destroy mine. When I tried to hint at this history during a phone conversation with Sarah, hoping that reminding her of my capacity for loyalty and sacrifice might soften her position. Betty's manipulation had already made such appeals impossible. "Mom, you're always trying to play the hero with your stories about helping people," Sarah said with obvious irritation. "Betty told me about your tendency to exaggerate your role in other people's lives. Your past choices are your own business, but right now, we need to focus on what's best for my children." The suggestion that my sacrifices for Betty were exaggerations or attempts to play the hero revealed how thoroughly my daughter's perception of me had been poisoned. Betty had apparently prepared responses to any attempt I might make to defend myself by referencing our shared history, turning even my acts of loyalty into evidence of my supposed tendency toward manipulation and self-aggrandizement. The formal legal response came through Mr. Smith, the attorney Sarah had hired to handle what was now being treated as a child protection case rather than a family dispute. His letter was a masterpiece of legal intimidation disguised as reasonable concern for child welfare. Mrs. Evelyn Thompson. The letter began with the kind of formal distance that transformed me from beloved mother and grandmother into potential defendant in a child endangerment case. Your continued attempts to contact my client and her children, despite clear requests for space and boundaries, constitute harassment and demonstrate a concerning inability to respect the welfare of minor children. The letter demanded that I cease all accusatory communications and submit to a court-ordered psychological evaluation to determine my fitness for any future contact with my grandchildren. It also threatened civil action for defamation if I continued to make false statements about the motivations of those who were legitimately concerned about child welfare. But perhaps the most devastating aspect of the legal pressure was the public nature of the demands being made against me. Betty and Mrs. Thompson, working in apparent coordination, began spreading the word that I was being monitored and might need to be placed in a facility for my own safety and the protection of others. "It's really sad what's happening to Evelyn," Betty told anyone who would listen, her voice dripping with false compassion. "The family is trying to get her the help she needs, but she's so resistant to acknowledging that there's a problem. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is insist that someone face reality." The narrative they had constructed was brilliantly designed to make any attempt I made to defend myself look like further evidence of my instability. If I remained silent, my silence was taken as admission of guilt. If I tried to present evidence of my innocence, my defensiveness was proof of my inability to accept reality. If I sought support from friends and neighbors, my manipulation of others demonstrated my danger to the community. They offered me a final solution that revealed the true purpose of their campaign, complete submission to their version of reality in exchange for the possibility of supervised contact with my grandchildren. I would be required to publicly apologize for my inappropriate behavior, acknowledge that my care of Michael and Emily had been inadequate, and agree to professional monitoring of any future interactions with them. The terms were designed to be humiliating and permanent, ensuring that even if I gained some limited access to my grandchildren, it would be on terms that constantly reminded everyone involved that I was a potentially dangerous person who required supervision to be around children safely. As I read through the proposed agreement, understanding that accepting it would mean confessing to crimes I hadn't committed and acknowledging failures that existed only in Betty's imagination, I felt the familiar stirring of something I recognized from my professional life as an archivist. It was the cold, analytical anger that came when I encountered attempts to falsify historical records, or force people to accept narratives that contradicted documented evidence. Betty and Sarah had made the same mistake that every amateur falsifier made. They assumed that destroying my emotional support would also destroy my ability to think clearly and gather evidence. But they had forgotten that I was a woman who had spent her entire career learning how to distinguish truth from lies, how to verify sources, and how to build cases based on documented facts rather than convenient fictions. The woman who had spent decades preserving other people's authentic histories was about to apply those same skills to preserving her own truth, regardless of how many people she had once trusted tried to stop her. The final legal blow came with the calculated precision of a well-orchestrated execution designed not just to exclude me from my grandchildren's lives, but to criminalize any attempt I might make to maintain the family relationships that had been the center of my existence for over a decade. The restraining order arrived by certified mail on a Monday morning that would forever mark the end of the family I thought I had built through love and devotion. Mr. Smith, the attorney Sarah, had hired to handle what was now being treated as a child protection case, had crafted the legal documents with devastating effectiveness. The temporary restraining order claimed that my pattern of harassment and erratic behavior regarding my grandchildren posed a direct threat to their emotional and physical safety, requiring immediate legal intervention. The language was clinical and damning, transforming my expressions of love into evidence of stalking my desire to spend time with Michael and Emily, into proof of dangerous obsession, and my attempts to defend myself against false accusations into confirmation of my mental instability. The order prohibited me from coming within 500 feet of my grandchildren, their school, their home, or any location where they might reasonably be expected to be present. Most devastating of all, the restraining order included specific language about my supposed history of inappropriate financial demands and my demonstrated inability to provide adequate supervision, making Betty's lies part of the official legal record that would follow me for years to come. Reading that document, seeing my role as loving grandmother transformed into that of a dangerous predator whose very presence threatened children's safety, I felt my understanding of justice and family love shift in ways that left me gasping for air. The legal system that was supposed to protect families had been weaponized against the very foundation of family connection. But I wasn't quite ready to surrender to their narrative of my supposed danger to children. In one last desperate attempt to reach whatever humanity remained in my daughter's heart, I decided to create a tangible reminder of what we had once shared, what she was choosing to destroy, based on lies told by someone who had never loved Michael and Emily the way I did. I spent an entire weekend creating a photo album of our most precious memories together. Michael's first steps taken in my living room while Sarah was at work. Emily's 5th birthday party, which I had planned and hosted in my backyard because Sarah couldn't afford to rent a venue. Christmas mornings when both children had spent the night at my house, their faces glowing with excitement as they opened presents I had saved for months to buy. I included photos of quiet moments that no one else had witnessed. Michael curled up in my lap while I read him stories about brave knights and magical kingdoms. Emily helping me bake cookies for her school fundraiser, her small hands covered in flour and her face serious with concentration. Family dinners where 3 generations had gathered around my dining room table, laughing and sharing stories about our days. Along with the photographs, I wrote a letter that poured my heart onto paper in ways I had never been able to do in person. I wrote about the little girl who used to call me Gamma because she couldn't pronounce grandma, who would run to my house after school because she knew I would always have time to listen to her stories about her day. I wrote about the boy who had once told me I was his bestest friend in the whole world, and asked if he could live with me forever so we could have adventures every day. I reminded Sarah of the values we had once shared, the importance of family loyalty and unconditional love that I had tried to model for her throughout her childhood. I wrote about the sacrifices I had made as a single mother to ensure that she never felt unloved or unprotected, and the joy I had found in being able to provide the same kind of security and devotion to her children. I left the album on Sarah's front porch, hoping that seeing our history laid out in photographs might spark some recognition of what we were all losing, some small crack in the wall of suspicion and fear that Betty had built around our family's hearts. 3 days later, I discovered their response in the most public and humiliating way possible. Betty had posted a photograph on social media showing my carefully compiled album torn apart, the pictures scattered, and many of them visibly cut into pieces with scissors. My handwritten letter had been shredded into confetti-like strips that were barely recognizable as text. Her caption was a masterpiece of calculated cruelty. Spring cleaning day, getting rid of clutter and moving forward from negativity. Some people just can't let go of the past and keep trying to manipulate with desperate attempts at emotional blackmail. So grateful for the wisdom to recognize toxic behavior disguised as love. The image of my grandchildren's baby pictures lying in shreds of my expressions of love, reduced to garbage for social media entertainment, hit me with a force that was almost physical. These weren't just photographs. They were the only tangible proof that our family's love had once been real, that the connections I remembered hadn't been figments of my imagination. Seeing those memories destroyed and mocked, publicly shared for the entertainment and approval of people who would never understand what they were witnessing, I finally grasped the complete finality of what my daughter had chosen. She hadn't just rejected my attempts at reconciliation. She had participated in the deliberate destruction of our shared history, deciding that our decades of love were less important than maintaining the narrative that painted me as a dangerous burden to be discarded. Sarah's response came in the form of a text message that felt like a final sentencing. Consider this matter closed, Mom. Don't contact us again, ever. You're causing too much trouble with your accusations and your refusal to accept reality. The word accusations revealed how completely she had internalized Betty's version of events. In Sarah's mind, I wasn't a mother seeking to understand why she was being cut off from her grandchildren. I was an unstable woman making false claims about innocent people who were only trying to protect children from harm. Betty's campaign of public destruction continued with systematic precision. She called mutual acquaintances and longtime neighbors, spreading carefully crafted stories about my supposed mental decline and dangerous fixation on my grandchildren. Her version of events painted me as a woman whose grief over her husband's death had eventually evolved into an unhealthy obsession with her daughter's family. It's really tragic what's happened to Evelyn. She would tell anyone who would listen her voice, carrying the perfect blend of sadness and concern. Losing her husband hit her harder than anyone realized, and she's never really recovered. Now she's so desperate for family connection that she can't see how her behavior is frightening the children. But it was my grandson's reaction during our final encounter that delivered the most devastating blow to whatever hope I still harbored for eventual reconciliation. When I saw Michael at the local park where I had taken him to play countless times over the years, his response was swift and brutal. "Grandma, you're crazy," he yelled loud enough for everyone within 100 yards to hear. Why don't you just die already so we can be happy without you bothering us all the time? The words came from an 8-year-old mouth, but they carried the sophisticated cruelty of adult manipulation. Someone had taught this child, whom I had loved unconditionally since the day he was born, to see my very existence as a threat to his family's happiness and to wish for my death as the solution to their problems. Driving home from that encounter, my hands shaking and my vision blurred by tears I couldn't control, I finally allowed myself to confront the most painful truth about what had led to this complete destruction of my family. The secret I had been carrying about Sarah's childhood trauma and my well-intentioned but ultimately devastating response to it. When Sarah was 7 years old, she had witnessed a horrific argument between her father and me, just months before his sudden death from a heart attack. The argument had been about his drinking, which had been getting progressively worse, and my demands that he seek treatment before it destroyed our family. Sarah had seen him strike me during that fight, the only time he had ever been physically violent, and she had also witnessed my decision to forgive him and try to work through our problems rather than leave. The trauma of seeing her father hit her mother, followed by his death, just weeks later, had left Sarah with deep psychological scars that manifested as a confused understanding of family dynamics and conflict resolution. In her child's mind, she had somehow connected my attempts to help her father with the violence that preceded his death, creating a distorted perception that my efforts to help people often led to harm rather than healing. Instead of getting Sarah the professional help she needed to process these traumatic experiences, I had made the decision to protect her from further pain by creating a false narrative about her childhood memories. I had hidden all evidence of her father's drinking and violence-removed photographs that might trigger painful memories, and even destroyed some of his personal belongings that might have reminded her of the darker aspects of our marriage. Most damaging of all, I had used my skills as an archivist to literally rewrite our family history, creating false documentation that portrayed her father as a loving husband who had died tragically young rather than a troubled man whose problems had created instability and fear in our home. I had thought I was protecting Sarah from painful truths that might damage her ability to form healthy relationships in the future. But my well-intentioned deception had backfired in the most devastating way possible. By hiding the reality of her father's problems and my struggles to deal with them, I had denied Sarah the opportunity to understand that conflict and difficulty in families could be addressed through honest communication and professional help. Instead, she had grown up with a distorted understanding of family dynamics that made her vulnerable to manipulation by people like Betty, who offered simple explanations for complex problems. The cosmic irony was unbearable. My attempt to protect my daughter from trauma had created a different kind of trauma, one that made her susceptible to believing the worst about me when someone she trusted presented her with a narrative that fit her confused understanding of how families worked. The same instinct that had led me to falsify documents to protect Betty from the consequences of her crimes had also led me to falsify family history to protect Sarah from painful truths, and both decisions had ultimately been used as weapons against me. But even in that moment of overwhelming realization, as I sat in my empty house, contemplating the possibility that my entire approach to protecting the people I loved had been fundamentally flawed, I felt something stirring in the deepest part of my soul. It wasn't hope exactly, though, that was present. It wasn't even determination, though, that was growing stronger with each revelation. It was the recognition that the woman who had spent her career learning how to distinguish authentic documents from clever forgeries, was finally ready to apply those same skills to examining the lies that had been told about her character and her fitness as a grandmother. For the first time since this nightmare began, I was ready to stop defending myself against false accusations and start building a case that would expose the truth about Betty's motivations and methods. The archivist, who had spent decades preserving other people's authentic histories, was about to undertake the most important documentation project of her career, preserving the truth about her own life and her love for her grandchildren, regardless of how many people she had once trusted tried to stop her. The restraining order transformed my home from a sanctuary of family memories into a psychological prison where every room whispered accusations about my fitness as a grandmother and my worth as a human being. The silence that filled the house wasn't just the absence of Michael and Emily's laughter. It was the suffocating weight of carrying the secret about Sarah's childhood trauma while being forbidden from using that knowledge to help her understand why she was so vulnerable to Betty's manipulation. Every morning, I woke up to the crushing realization that my attempts to protect my daughter from painful truths had created the very vulnerability that was now being exploited to destroy our family. The carefully constructed narrative I had built around her father's death, the documents I had hidden, the memories I had altered, all of it had been designed to shield her from trauma, but had instead left her defenseless against someone who understood exactly which lies would resonate with her confused understanding of family dynamics. My training as an archivist had taught me to value truth above all else, but my love as a mother had led me to suppress that truth when I thought it would protect my child. Now I was being punished for both choices, condemned for being a truth-preserving professional who couldn't be trusted with accurate family history, and isolated from the daughter I had tried to protect from the very kind of deception that was now being used against me. The professional destruction that followed was swift and devastating, orchestrated with the precision of people who understood exactly how to destroy a reputation built over decades of meticulous work. Mrs. Thompson, the neighborhood blogger, had transformed from a source of harmless local gossip into the epicenter of a sophisticated character assassination campaign that reached far beyond our small community. Her blog posts about my supposed mental decline weren't just casual observations. They were carefully researched hit pieces that used fabricated eyewitness accounts from Betty and other neighbors who had been convinced to participate in what they believed was a legitimate child protection effort. Multiple concerned neighbors have reported observing concerning behavior from former archivist Evelyn Thompson. Mrs. Thompson wrote in a post that was shared hundreds of times across social media. Sources close to the family describe a pattern of erratic behavior, financial demands on her daughter's family, and what appears to be increasing confusion about past events and family relationships. The posts carefully avoided making any claims that could be proven false, instead relying on vague references to concerns and observations that created an impression of widespread worry about my mental state without providing any specific evidence that could be challenged in court. But Mrs. Thompson's real genius lay in connecting my supposed personal decline to questions about my professional competence during my years as an archivist. Her posts began to suggest that if I was capable of neglecting my own grandchildren and making false accusations against concerned neighbors, perhaps I had also been capable of manipulating historical records during my career. Given recent revelations about Mrs. Thompson's concerning behavior, she wrote in a particularly damaging post, "Some community members are beginning to wonder whether our local historical records may have been influenced by personal biases or family loyalties rather than objective historical accuracy. The suggestion that I might have used my position to create unstable fantasies about local history was devastatingly effective because it was impossible to disprove without reviewing thousands of documents, and the very act of having to defend my professional integrity suggested that there might be something worth investigating. The impact on my professional relationships was immediate and comprehensive. Academic conferences that had once sought my expertise began quietly canceling my speaking engagements. Historical societies that had once valued my contributions suddenly found reasons to distance themselves from any association with my work. My decades of careful documentation and meticulous research were being transformed into evidence of potential professional misconduct. But the financial destruction that followed was perhaps even more devastating than the professional isolation. The legal fees from defending against Sarah's visitation termination and the defamation lawsuit that Betty had convinced her to file began consuming my modest retirement savings with terrifying speed. Betty had cleverly reported suspicious activity in my bank accounts to financial institutions, claiming she was concerned about my mental capacity to manage money responsibly. She presented herself as a worried friend who had noticed erratic financial decisions and concerning spending patterns that might indicate cognitive decline or exploitation by unscrupulous people. The result was immediate freezing of my assets, pending a competency evaluation that could take months to complete, leaving me unable to pay for basic necessities while legal fees continued to mount. Within weeks, I was facing eviction from my beloved home, the place where I had raised Sarah and created countless memories with my grandchildren. The eviction itself was orchestrated as a public spectacle designed to cement the narrative of my supposed mental decline and dangerous behavior. Betty had somehow arranged for local media to cover the story, presenting it as a cautionary tale about the importance of family intervention when elderly relatives refuse help for mental health issues. The news cameras captured me, standing on the sidewalk with my few remaining possessions in garbage bags, the image broadcast as evidence of what happens when families fail to take appropriate action when an elderly relative shows signs of declining judgment. This tragic situation highlights the importance of early intervention when family members notice signs of cognitive decline or dangerous behavior, the news anchor explained as footage of my humiliation-filled television screens across our community. Mrs. Thompson's family tried to get her help, but sometimes love means making difficult decisions to protect both the individual and the children involved. But it was my grandchildren's public disavowal that delivered the final blow to whatever hope I still harbored for family reconciliation. Sarah had arranged for Michael and Emily to participate in a child safety awareness campaign sponsored by a local advocacy group that promoted protective parenting strategies. The event was heavily promoted as an example of children learning to recognize and report unsafe situations, with my grandchildren featured as brave young people who had learned to protect themselves from difficult family members who might not have their best interests at heart. Michael, now 10 years old and clearly coached in what to say, delivered a polished presentation about brave parents who make hard choices to protect their children from people who might hurt them or make them feel unsafe. Sometimes, he said, with the earnest confidence of a child who had been taught to believe what he was saying, grown-ups who are supposed to love you might not be safe anymore. It's important to listen to your parents when they tell you someone isn't good for you, even if that person used to be someone you trusted. Emily, only 8 years old, but already fluent in the language of rejection she had learned from the adults around her, presented a drawing of her ideal safe family that conspicuously excluded any representation of me. When asked about her artistic choices, she explained with heartbreaking seriousness that healthy families only include people who make children feel safe and loved. Watching my grandchildren, whom I had helped raise from infancy and who had once called me their favorite person in the whole world, publicly dismiss me as a source of danger rather than love, was like watching my own funeral while being forced to applaud the eulogies. But in my darkest moment, when I was literally living in a homeless shelter and contemplating whether I had the strength to continue fighting against such overwhelming opposition, an unexpected voice reached out from my professional past with an offer of hope that would change everything. Dr. Margaret Foster, an elderly woman whose complex genealogical puzzle I had helped solve 15 years earlier, contacted me after seeing news coverage of my situation. She had spent months trying to locate me through professional networks, and when she finally tracked me down to the shelter, her words carried the weight of someone who truly understood my character. "Evelyn," she said when she found me in that sterile facility, tears in her eyes as she took in my reduced circumstances, "I don't know what's really happening with your family, but I know who you are professionally. You're the most thorough and ethical researcher I've ever worked with. If you say there's something wrong with these accusations, then there's something wrong with these accusations." Dr. Foster didn't just offer words of support. She provided something far more valuable: access to a network of retired legal professionals who specialized in complex elder fraud and defamation cases, along with the financial resources to help me fight back against the systematic campaign being waged against me. "There are people who remember your real work," she told me, her hand steady on my trembling shoulder, "and we're not going to let them destroy the reputation you spent 40 years building just because the truth is inconvenient for some people who want to silence you." For the first time in months, sitting in that sterile shelter, surrounded by other discarded souls, I felt something I had almost forgotten: professional validation that my skills and judgment weren't delusions, that my understanding of truth and evidence wasn't the paranoid fantasy my family claimed it was. The fight was far from over, but now I had allies who understood the difference between legitimate concern for child welfare and sophisticated character assassination, between protecting vulnerable family members and destroying inconvenient relatives who pose threats to carefully constructed narratives. Most importantly, I was beginning to remember who I really was beneath the layers of doubt and shame that my own daughter and best friend had heaped upon me, a woman who had spent her career distinguishing truth from lies, and who was about to apply those same skills to the most important case of her life. The Historical Reckoning exhibit was announced with the kind of academic fanfare usually reserved for major scholarly discoveries, prominently featured in both local media and professional historical journals, as a groundbreaking effort to re-examine local family narratives through a contemporary lens. Seeing the Historical Society, where I had devoted decades of volunteer work, being transformed into a platform for the systematic destruction of my professional legacy, felt like watching vandals desecrate a sacred space. Sarah and Mark, leveraging their professional networks and the social standing that my own work had helped establish for our family, had convinced the Historical Society Board to create an exhibit that would correct historical inaccuracies and present a more complete picture of prominent local families, including our own. The timing was no coincidence. This was a direct response to my ongoing attempts to defend myself against their accusations, designed to create an official academic record that would support their narrative about my supposed professional incompetence and personal instability. The exhibit featured beautifully mounted displays with museum-quality presentation standards, professional lighting, and what appeared to be authentic historical documents that told a carefully revised version of our family's story. But I recognized the subtle signs of manipulation from my years of working with archival materials documents that had been selectively edited photographs that had been digitally altered and timelines that omitted crucial events and relationships. Most devastating was how they had reframed my own archival work. Display cases featured examples of what they called historical oversights and emotional bias in record keeping, presenting my decades of careful documentation as evidence of professional incompetence rather than meticulous attention to detail. The Thompson family archives demonstrate the importance of objective historical analysis, read one particularly damaging placard. While earlier documentation may have been influenced by personal relationships and family loyalties, contemporary research methods allow us to present a more accurate and complete historical picture. The exhibit didn't just attack my competence. It attacked my fundamental integrity as a guardian of historical truth. Every careful choice I had made to preserve family privacy while maintaining historical accuracy was reframed as evidence of deliberate distortion or professional bias. Mark's role as one of the featured speakers at the exhibit's opening gave him a platform to position himself as a champion of historical integrity and objective scholarship. His presentation, titled Beyond Family Myths, The Importance of Evidence-Based Historical Research, was a masterclass in using legitimate academic principles to justify personal attacks. In our digital age, we have access to research tools and verification methods that weren't available to previous generations of archivists, he said to the gathered crowd of academics, community leaders, and local media. This allows us to identify and correct instances where family relationships may have influenced professional judgment, ensuring that future generations inherit accurate rather than romanticized historical records. His words were carefully chosen to sound like objective scholarly analysis while delivering pointed attacks on my character and professional methods. He spoke about the importance of separating personal attachment from historical accuracy and the need for professional boundaries that prevent family loyalties from contaminating archival integrity. Sarah's contribution came during a panel discussion about healing family wounds through historical truth. She spoke with practiced vulnerability about the challenge of accepting difficult truths about family members you love and the importance of choosing accuracy over comfort when preserving family history. Sometimes, she said with perfectly calibrated emotion, the most loving thing you can do for future generations is acknowledge that previous family historians may have allowed personal feelings to influence their work. It's not about blame. It's about ensuring that our children inherit truth rather than well-meaning fiction. From the homeless shelter where I was now living, I learned about the exhibit through a sympathetic former colleague who managed to obtain a copy of the promotional materials and mail them to me. Reading through the exhibit descriptions, seeing my life's work systematically undermined, and my professional reputation deliberately destroyed by my own children felt like watching my professional obituary being written while I was still alive. The materials included quotes from community leaders praising the exhibit as an important corrective to decades of incomplete historical documentation and a necessary restoration of scholarly integrity to local family research. Academic reviewers from neighboring universities commended the courageous decision to prioritize historical accuracy over family comfort. But it was my grandchildren's participation that delivered the most devastating blow to whatever hope I still maintained for eventual reconciliation. Michael and Emily had been featured prominently in the exhibit's promotional campaign as representatives of the next generation who would benefit from more accurate historical documentation. The local newspaper's coverage included photographs of them standing proudly beside displays that systematically dismantled my professional reputation, their young faces serious with the importance of their role as guardians of historical truth. Michael was quoted as saying he was proud to learn the real story of his family's history, while Emily spoke about how important it is to have facts instead of stories that aren't completely true. Their words had clearly been coached, but their apparent belief in what they were saying made the betrayal complete. The exhibit's accompanying academic symposium on genealogical ethics and professional standards featured Mr. Smith, the attorney Sarah had hired to handle my legal troubles, as a keynote speaker. His presentation gave him a platform to establish the legal and ethical framework that justified their actions against me. His lecture, titled "When Family Research Becomes Family Manipulation, Legal and Ethical Boundaries in Genealogical Investigation," was a thinly veiled attack on everything I represented as both a professional and a family member. We sometimes encounter cases where individuals use their professional credentials or supposed expertise to manipulate family narratives for personal gain, he said with the authority of legal expertise. Professional standards require us to recognize when emotional investment in family systems compromises our ability to maintain objective analytical standards. While he never mentioned me by name, anyone familiar with my situation would understand exactly who he was discussing. His presentation provided academic and legal justification for treating my professional work as suspect and my personal struggles as evidence of dangerous instability. As I sat in the shelter that evening, reading coverage of the symposium and seeing my decades of careful scholarship transformed into a cautionary tale about the dangers of allowing family relationships to influence professional judgment, I felt something break inside me that I wasn't sure could ever be repaired. The exhibit wasn't just rewriting my family's history. It was establishing an academic record that would make it nearly impossible for me to ever restore my professional reputation or credibility as a source of reliable historical information. But just as I was about to surrender to the overwhelming weight of institutional opposition arrayed against me, an unexpected ally emerged from my professional past with information that would change everything. Dr. William Chen, a retired historian and town archivist who was nearing 85 but still sharp as a razor, approached me outside the shelter where I was living. He had been following the exhibit coverage with growing alarm and professional outrage. "Evelyn," he said, his aged voice still carrying the authority of someone who had spent 60 years working with historical documents, "I've been watching what they're doing to you, and I need to tell you something important that I should have mentioned years ago." His revelation was like lightning striking my consciousness. Decades earlier, when I had been focused on other projects, he had witnessed Dr. Thompson, the family physician, who had delivered Sarah attempting to retrieve and alter old public records from the county archives. At the time, Dr. Chen had found it suspicious, but hadn't known what to make of it. That doctor was nervous as a cat in a thunderstorm. Dr. Chen told me his memory crystal clear despite his advanced age. He kept looking around to make sure nobody was watching, and when he saw me, he made up some story about needing to verify medical records for a malpractice insurance claim. But Evelyn, nobody goes into birth records from the 1940s for insurance purposes. This small but crucial piece of evidence confirmed what I had begun to suspect. There were legitimate questions about the accuracy of official family records, and my professional instincts about hidden documentation had been correct all along. Dr. Thompson's attempt to alter historical records proved that there were documents that contradicted official narratives and that people with something to hide were still working to keep those contradictions buried. For the first time since this nightmare began, I had evidence that someone besides me recognized discrepancies in the historical record, and that my professional expertise in identifying document manipulation hadn't been the paranoid delusion my family claimed it was. More importantly, I had an ally whose professional reputation and advanced age made him virtually immune to the kind of character assassination that had been used against me. Dr. Chen's witness testimony provided the foundation for everything that would follow. The woman who had spent her career preserving authentic historical records was about to discover whether 6 decades of professional expertise and one elderly archivist's witness testimony could overcome the most sophisticated historical revision campaign she had ever encountered. The final financial assault came with the surgical precision of a coordinated attack designed not just to bankrupt me, but to strip away every last vestige of dignity and independence that might allow me to continue fighting for my reputation and my relationship with my grandchildren. The lawsuit that Daniel Morrison filed against me was the culmination of months of careful planning by people who understood exactly how to use the legal system as a weapon against someone with limited resources. Daniel had appeared in my life just as my family crisis was reaching its peak, claiming to be the illegitimate son of my deceased father and demanding his share of an inheritance that had been wrongfully denied to him for decades. His lawsuit demanded $250,000 in damages for what he claimed was my systematic defamation of his character and my malicious attempts to prevent him from claiming his rightful place in our family. But the financial claims were just the surface of a much deeper strategy designed to destroy my credibility and my ability to defend myself. Working in apparent coordination with Betty and my own children, Daniel had contacted every professional organization I had ever belonged to, presenting himself as a concerned family member, trying to protect the community from my increasingly erratic behavior. "I'm deeply worried about Evelyn's mental capacity," he told administrators at the Historical Society where I had volunteered for decades, his voice carrying the perfect blend of familial concern and civic responsibility. "She's been making wild accusations about family members based on documents she claims to have found, but which appear to have been altered or completely fabricated. I think she may be suffering from some form of dementia that's affecting her judgment about historical accuracy." His campaign was devastatingly effective because it positioned him as a responsible family member, trying to protect both the community and me from the consequences of my supposed mental decline. Historical societies and academic institutions, faced with potential liability issues, quickly moved to distance themselves from any association with my work or reputation. My modest pension from years of volunteer work was frozen, pending a competency evaluation, and my access to professional archives and databases was quietly revoked. The small income that had allowed me to maintain some independence while fighting the accusations against me disappeared overnight, leaving me completely dependent on whatever assistance I could find. The mounting legal fees from defending against Daniel's lawsuit consumed what little savings I had managed to preserve after the earlier financial manipulations. The attorney I was able to afford was clearly outmatched by the team of lawyers representing Daniel, who seemed to have unlimited resources for depositions, expert witnesses, and procedural delays designed to drain my remaining assets. Within months, I was facing eviction from the small apartment that had been my refuge after losing my family home. The landlord, pressured by complaints about my disturbing behavior from neighbors who had been contacted by Betty, was eager to remove what he saw as a problematic tenant who might damage his property's reputation. The eviction was timed and orchestrated to maximize my public humiliation. Somehow, local media had been notified about the timing, and news cameras were present when the sheriff's deputies arrived to remove me and my belongings from the apartment. The story was framed as a tragic example of what happens when families fail to intervene appropriately with elderly relatives who refuse help for mental health issues. This heartbreaking situation demonstrates the importance of early family intervention when loved ones show signs of cognitive decline. The news anchor explained as footage of me standing on the sidewalk with my possessions in garbage bags filled television screens across the community. Sarah and Mark's response to my homelessness was chilling in its calculated indifference. When approached by reporters for comment on my situation, Mark issued a statement expressing sadness about my condition, while making it clear that they had exhausted all available options for providing appropriate support. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone who refuses help is allow them to experience the natural consequences of their choices, he said, with the kind of measured wisdom that made him sound like a grief counselor rather than a son abandoning his mother. We hope this will finally convince her to accept the professional assistance she needs. Sarah's contribution came through her social media presence, where she posted about the challenges of loving someone who refuses to accept reality, while sharing inspirational quotes about protecting your peace from toxic family members. Her posts never mentioned me directly, but followers who knew our family situation understood exactly who she was discussing. But it was Daniel's public display of wealth that felt like the most calculated insult of all. Using money from the inheritance he claimed was rightfully his, he made a substantial donation to establish a family heritage fund at the local historical society, the same institution where I had devoted decades of volunteer work. The donation ceremony was heavily covered by local media, with Daniel presenting himself as a generous benefactor who was honoring his father's memory through support for historical preservation. He dedicated the fund to Sarah and Mark as a tribute to their strength and wisdom in preserving family truth, making sure the photographs were widely shared across social media platforms. The fund, which cost more than I had earned in 5 years of professional work, was presented as Daniel's commitment to ensuring that future generations inherit accurate rather than romanticized historical records. The irony was devastating. Money that he claimed from my father's estate was being used to fund the very institution that had been turned against me, creating a permanent monument to my professional disgrace. The physical toll of this relentless financial and emotional siege finally became too much for my 70-year-old body to bear. The stress of homelessness, the inadequate nutrition available at the shelter, and the constant anxiety of fighting legal battles I couldn't afford triggered a massive heart attack that left me unconscious in the emergency room of the county hospital. For 6 days, I lay in intensive care while my body fought to recover from the damage that months of systematic persecution had inflicted. My heart rhythm was irregular, my blood pressure dangerously unstable, and my kidneys were beginning to fail from the stress and dehydration of shelter life. But it was during those long hours, drifting between consciousness and unconsciousness, that something unexpected happened. As I lay connected to machines that monitored my failing body, fragments of memory began to surface from deep in my subconscious, pieces of conversations I had overheard as a young woman, but had never fully understood until now. I remembered a conversation from my 20s when I was working as a junior archivist and had overheard my father arguing with Mr. Davies, our family's longtime attorney, about a secret client and documents that needed to be modified, related to an estate case from decades earlier. At the time, I had dismissed it as normal legal business that didn't concern me. But now, with the clarity that sometimes comes from approaching death, I understood that conversation in a completely different context. My father hadn't just been discussing routine legal work. He had been participating in covering up adoption records and falsifying documents related to family lineage, the same kind of systematic deception that Daniel was now claiming gave him rights to our family's inheritance. The realization that my own father had been complicit in the kind of document falsification that I had spent my career learning to detect hit me with a force that felt like another heart attack. Every principle of historical accuracy and archival integrity that he had taught me to value had been shadowed by his own willingness to participate in deception when it served his interests. But even in that moment of overwhelming betrayal and physical collapse, I felt something stir in the deepest part of my soul. It wasn't hope exactly, though, that was present. It wasn't even determination, though, that was growing stronger with each revelation. It was the recognition that the woman who had spent her career uncovering buried truths was facing the most important investigation of her life, not just proving her fitness as a grandmother, but exposing a pattern of document falsification and inheritance fraud that might stretch back for generations. From my hospital bed, weak but alive and burning, with newfound clarity about the conspiracy that had shaped not just my current crisis, but potentially my entire family's history, I felt a determination I hadn't experienced since my early days as a professional archivist, encountering my first case of systematic document falsification. The near-death experience had burned away the last of my illusions about my family's capacity for truth and reconciliation, but it had also crystallized my understanding of what I was really fighting against, not just personal betrayal, but a sophisticated pattern of deception that might involve falsified inheritance records, manipulated family documents, and decades of carefully maintained lies. With the help of Jennifer, a compassionate night nurse who had been horrified by my complete isolation, during the darkest days of my hospitalization, I managed to record a video message on my phone. My voice was still weak from the medical trauma, but my words carried the weight of a lifetime of professional experience with family secrets and hidden documentation. In the 40-minute recording, I methodically laid out the evidence I had gathered about the systematic campaign against me. But more importantly, I presented my professional analysis of the discrepancies I had identified in official family records. I played portions of audio recordings I had secretly made during family confrontations, capturing Sarah and Mark's explicit dismissal of my concerns and their prioritization of social standing over truth. "Listen to their voices," I said to the camera, my hands trembling, but my resolve steady despite my physical limitations. These are people who claim to value historical accuracy and family integrity, but who are willing to destroy evidence and silence investigation when that accuracy threatens their preferred narrative. But the most powerful part of the recording came when I played a voicemail my father had left me years before his death, a message I had saved sentimentally but never really understood until my recent revelations about his involvement in document falsification. "Evelyn, my dear," his recorded voice said through my phone's speaker, the words heavy with what I had thought was general regret, but now recognized as specific guilt. "I hope you know that everything I did in my legal work, I did to protect family stability. Sometimes protecting people means making choices about what information serves the greater good. I pray that you'll understand the difficult positions that family loyalty sometimes requires." At the time, I had assumed he was talking about normal attorney-client privilege and the kinds of ethical challenges all lawyers faced. Now I understood he was confessing to a lifetime of participation in inheritance fraud and document falsification while asking for forgiveness he didn't think he deserved. The recording was my final attempt to reach whatever integrity remained in my children's hearts, my last appeal for them to choose truth over the continued protection of fraudulent inheritance claims and falsified family records. I asked Jennifer to send it directly to Sarah and Mark's email addresses, hoping that seeing my obvious physical decline might shock them into recognizing what their campaign against me was costing. But I had underestimated the reach of the conspiracy arrayed against me. Daniel, working with sophisticated surveillance technology and bribed hospital staff, had been monitoring my communications and intercepted my video message before Sarah and Mark could see it, recognizing it as a potential threat to the inheritance fraud he was perpetrating. Within hours, my raw emotional testimony had been digitally manipulated using editing software that transformed my careful analysis of document discrepancies into what appeared to be the paranoid rambling of a severely mentally ill woman. Daniel carefully spliced sentences to change their meaning, added ominous background music that made my words sound threatening rather than analytical, and cut out crucial context that would have explained my references to inheritance fraud and document falsification. The doctored video was then sold to a national news outlet that specialized in sensational stories about family dysfunction and elder mental health. The story was framed as an expose of what happens when untreated mental illness combines with professional expertise to create dangerous delusions about family members and institutional conspiracies. This tragic case illustrates the growing problem of elderly Americans who become convinced that their families and community institutions are part of elaborate conspiracies against them. The news anchor explained as my distorted image filled television screens across the country. Mental health experts warn that these kinds of paranoid delusions can be particularly dangerous when they involve individuals with professional backgrounds in research or investigation. The manipulated video went viral within hours, shared across social media platforms, with commentary that ranged from pity to outrage. Viewers who saw only the edited version were horrified by what appeared to be a mentally ill woman making wild accusations against her family while claiming expertise in areas where she was clearly delusional. Sarah and Mark's response was swift and devastating. They appeared on national television within 24 hours of the video's release, giving interviews that were masterpieces of public manipulation. Sitting together with their attorney present to lend credibility to their statements, they spoke with perfect sincerity about their heartbreak over my deteriorating condition. Watching someone you love disappear into mental illness is one of the most painful experiences a family can face. Mark said, his voice catching with what appeared to be genuine emotion. The woman in that video isn't the mother who raised us. She's become someone we don't recognize, someone who sees threats and conspiracies where there are only people trying to help her. Sarah's contribution was even more devastating because it carried the weight of a daughter's supposed grief. "We've tried everything," she said through carefully timed tears. Professional intervention, family counseling, even legal boundaries, when her accusations became dangerous to our children's emotional well-being. But you can't help someone who refuses to acknowledge that they need help. Their attorney's presence during the interview sent a subtle but unmistakable message about the seriousness of my supposed threats to their family's safety. His occasional nods of legal authority reinforced their narrative while positioning them as responsible family members dealing with an impossible situation. "We just want her to find peace," Mark concluded, looking directly into the camera, with eyes that appeared to hold genuine love and concern. "But we also have to protect our children from exposure to these kinds of delusions. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is maintain firm boundaries with people who refuse to accept reality." Watching my children perform their grief over my supposed mental decline while simultaneously orchestrating my public humiliation was like witnessing my own execution while being forced to applaud the skill of my executioners. They had taken my most desperate attempt to expose inheritance fraud and document falsification and transformed it into the ultimate proof of everything they claimed about my mental instability. But even as I felt the crushing weight of complete defeat, an unexpected ally emerged from my professional past with evidence that would begin to turn the tide. Dr. Robert Martinez, the forensic genealogist who had been quietly investigating Daniel's inheritance claims, had been following the media coverage with growing alarm and professional outrage. As someone with expertise in both historical document analysis and digital forensics, Dr. Martinez immediately recognized the signs of sophisticated manipulation in the viral video. He contacted Dr. Foster, who connected him with my legal support network, and together they began building a case that would expose the fraud that had been perpetrated against me. "This isn't just character assassination," Dr. Martinez told the growing team of advocates who were rallying to my defense. "This is a coordinated disinformation campaign using advanced technology to literally put words in someone's mouth. The technical analysis alone proves that this video has been extensively manipulated. More importantly, Dr. Martinez had been making breakthrough discoveries in his investigation of Daniel's inheritance claims. Using genealogical databases and document analysis techniques that hadn't existed when the original deceptions were created, he had uncovered evidence that Daniel's claim to be my father's illegitimate son was based on falsified documents and fabricated evidence. I have documentary proof that Daniel Morrison's inheritance claim is fraudulent," he said with obvious anger at what he was discovering. "The birth records, the DNA evidence, even the legal documents supporting his case, all of it has been systematically falsified using techniques that mirror the document manipulation Evelyn identified in her professional work. For the first time in months, I had objective evidence that my professional instincts about document falsification weren't the paranoid delusions my family claimed they were. The technical proof that my video had been manipulated, combined with the genealogical evidence Dr. Martinez was uncovering, provided a foundation for fighting back against the most sophisticated campaign of deception I had ever encountered. The woman who had spent her career distinguishing authentic documents from clever forgeries was about to discover whether decades of professional expertise could overcome a conspiracy that involved not just my family's betrayal, but systematic fraud that might stretch back for generations and involve some of the most trusted institutions in our community. The breakthrough that transformed everything came from the combination of my professional training in document analysis and the cutting-edge forensic technology that Dr. Martinez brought to bear on Daniel's fraudulent inheritance claims. Armed with irrefutable evidence of digital manipulation, systematic document falsification, and decades of coordinated deception, my legal team launched a federal civil and criminal lawsuit that would expose the full scope of the conspiracy that had nearly destroyed my life. The charges were comprehensive and devastating fraud conspiracy to conceal identity, systematic elder abuse, defamation, and federal crimes related to the falsification of government documents and inheritance records. But most importantly, the lawsuit included groundbreaking charges related to the use of digital manipulation to create fraudulent evidence in civil proceedings crimes that would set precedent for future elder abuse and inheritance fraud cases. The case attracted national attention, not just because of the viral video that had destroyed my reputation, but because it represented the first major federal prosecution to combine elder abuse inheritance fraud and sophisticated digital deception in a single coordinated conspiracy that involved multiple family members and professional accomplices. When the trial began 8 months later, the courtroom was packed with reporters from around the world, legal experts studying the precedent-setting nature of the charges, and genealogy professionals who understood the implications for their own work. The story had captured public imagination because it combined elements of family betrayal, professional corruption, and the kind of sophisticated deception that most people assumed only happened in espionage thrillers. I sat at the plaintiff's table, still bearing the physical effects of my heart attack, but mentally sharper than I had been in years. The months of preparation had given me a sense of purpose I hadn't felt since my peak years as a professional archivist, and I was finally going to see justice for crimes that had been hidden through decades of systematic deception. The moment that shattered the defense's case came when Dr. Martinez took the stand as our expert witness in forensic genealogy and document analysis. He had spent months meticulously reconstructing the true history of Daniel's inheritance claims using DNA evidence, digital forensics, and archival research techniques that hadn't existed when the original fraud was perpetrated. "Your Honor, members of the jury," he began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent 30 years distinguishing authentic family records from sophisticated forgeries. "I'm about to present evidence that will prove Daniel Morrison's inheritance claims are based on systematically falsified documents, and that this fraud has been maintained through a conspiracy involving multiple family members, legal professionals, and medical practitioners." He began with a comprehensive analysis of Daniel's supposed birth records using techniques that revealed how the documents had been created using materials and methods that hadn't existed at the time they were supposedly generated. Through carbon dating, ink analysis, and paper composition studies, he proved conclusively that Daniel's authentic family documents had been created within the last 5 years. DNA evidence obtained from public records conclusively proves that Daniel Morrison shares no genetic relationship with the Thompson family line. Dr. Martinez testified his words, creating a stunned silence in the courtroom that was broken only by the sound of reporters frantically typing updates. But the most devastating evidence came when he revealed how Betty's 20-year campaign against me had been orchestrated. Using digital forensics and social media analysis, he had uncovered a sophisticated network of fake accounts, manipulated photographs, and coordinated messaging campaigns that proved Betty's slander hadn't been spontaneous neighbor concern, but a carefully planned character assassination operation. The defendant, Betty Morrison, systematically created false documentation of Mrs. Thompson's supposed neglect of her grandchildren. Dr. Martinez explained displaying digitally enhanced photographs that revealed how images had been manipulated to suggest neglect where none had occurred. The courtroom erupted when Dr. Martinez revealed that Betty was actually Daniel's wife, that their entire relationship with our family had been an elaborate fraud designed to gain access to inheritance information and create opportunities for character assassination that would support Daniel's fraudulent claims. Dr. Thompson's testimony finally shattered any remaining doubt about the scope of the conspiracy. Now, in his 80s and facing criminal charges for his role in falsifying medical records decades earlier, the retired physician broke down completely when confronted with the irrefutable evidence of his participation in the fraud. They paid me more money than I made in 5 years of medical practice to create false birth records and maintain the deception, he confessed through tears that seemed to carry the weight of decades of guilt. I knew it was wrong, but I convinced myself I was protecting families from scandal. I never imagined it would be used to hurt innocent people like Mrs. Thompson. His testimony revealed that the document falsification had been far more extensive than anyone had realized, involving not just birth records, but medical files, school records, and even property deeds that had been systematically altered to support various fraudulent inheritance claims over the decades. Daniel's response to this overwhelming evidence was perhaps the most dramatic moment of the entire trial. Faced with proof that his entire identity was fabricated and that his marriage to Betty had been part of an elaborate fraud conspiracy, he suffered a complete psychological breakdown that was captured by every camera in the courtroom. His carefully constructed facade of confident authority crumbled into incoherent screams of rage and desperate denials that only served to confirm his guilt and malice. "She's lying. They're all lying. I have rights. I have documents," he screamed as court security moved to restrain him, his professional composure replaced by the desperate fury of someone whose entire fabricated life had been exposed. But it was Mark's testimony that proved to be the most emotionally devastating moment of the trial. My son faced with the undeniable truth about Betty's identity, Daniel's fraudulent claims, and his own participation in destroying his mother's reputation to support a criminal conspiracy, walked to the witness stand like a man approaching his own execution. When our attorney presented him with the evidence of Betty's deception and Daniel's fraud, including recorded conversations where he had explicitly stated that protecting our family's financial interests was more important than my right to see my grandchildren, Mark's carefully maintained composure finally shattered. "I knew," he whispered, his voice breaking, as the weight of his betrayal settled upon him. "I knew something wasn't right about Daniel's claims, and I knew Betty's stories about Mom didn't match the grandmother I remembered. But I was terrified of losing the inheritance, terrified of admitting I'd been fooled by criminals who were using our family." His breakdown was complete and public, his body shaking with sobs as he was forced to confront the magnitude of his cruelty toward his own mother. "She gave everything for us, and I helped criminals destroy her to protect money that wasn't even real. I don't know how to live with what I've become." Sarah sat in the gallery throughout Mark's testimony, tears streaming down her face as she witnessed the complete destruction of the narrative she had been manipulated into believing. Betty Daniel's wife and co-conspirator sat frozen at the defense table, her decades of careful manipulation finally exposed to the light of legal scrutiny. Watching my family's lies crumble in real-time broadcast, live to a world that had believed their carefully constructed narrative about my supposed mental decline and dangerous behavior, I felt something I hadn't experienced in over 2 years: complete vindication. The woman who had been painted as a delusional conspiracy theorist was revealed to be a legitimate victim of an actual conspiracy involving inheritance fraud, document falsification, and systematic elder abuse. The family members who had claimed to be protecting children from a dangerous grandmother were exposed as participants in a criminal enterprise that had used those same children as weapons against their primary victim. The truth in all its complex and painful reality was finally being heard. And while the cost of that truth was devastating for everyone involved, I knew that justice was not just being served. It was being witnessed by millions of people who would never again be able to dismiss elder abuse allegations as family disputes or assume that sophisticated criminals couldn't operate within trusted community institutions. The jury's verdict was as swift as it was comprehensive. After deliberating for less than 6 hours, they returned with unanimous findings of guilt on all charges. Judge Margaret Foster, her voice carrying the weight of decades of experience with family court cases and fraud prosecution, delivered a ruling that would become landmark precedent for elder abuse and inheritance fraud cases nationwide. Daniel Morrison and Betty Morrison. She declared her words, echoing through the packed courtroom and broadcast live to millions of viewers. You have been found guilty of conspiracy to commit fraud, systematic elder abuse, criminal impersonation, and the falsification of government documents. The evidence presented in this case reveals a level of calculated deception that extends far beyond family dysfunction into the realm of organized crime. The sentences were severe and reflected the sophisticated nature of the crimes. Daniel was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison for his role as the primary architect of the inheritance fraud. Betty received 10 years for her systematic campaign of character assassination and her participation in the document falsification conspiracy. Both faced additional financial penalties that would ensure they could never profit from their crimes. Mark received 5 years in federal prison for his knowing participation in elder abuse and his role in helping criminals access family financial information. The judge noted that while his actions were less central to the conspiracy, his betrayal of his mother's trust had enabled the fraud to continue and had caused devastating harm to a vulnerable elderly person. Sarah faced 3 years of supervised probation and substantial financial penalties for her role in facilitating the abuse of her mother, though the judge acknowledged that she had been more victim than perpetrator in the sophisticated manipulation campaign that had turned her against me. Dr. Thompson, now 83 years old, faced immediate revocation of his medical license and criminal charges for his decades-old role in falsifying medical documents. The man who had built his career on the trust of families seeking medical care for their children was finally being held accountable for violating that trust in the most fundamental way possible. But beyond the criminal penalties, Judge Foster delivered something even more valuable to me, a formal judicial recognition of my character and professional integrity that would become part of the permanent legal record and would be used in legal education for generations to come. Evelyn Thompson, she said, looking directly at me with eyes that held both compassion and deep respect. This court recognizes your lifelong dedication to historical accuracy, your unwavering commitment to truth in family documentation and your professional integrity as an archivist. Your reputation has been systematically attacked through one of the most sophisticated fraud and manipulation campaigns this court has ever encountered. But today, we restore the truth about who you really are. Her statement continued with a powerful condemnation of the tactics that had been used against me. This case represents a disturbing evolution in elder abuse, where criminals use intimate family knowledge and professional credentials to destroy their victims' credibility before systematically exploiting them. The court warns that such sophisticated abuse will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of federal law. The aftermath moved with swift efficiency. Within hours of the verdict, news outlets across the country were retracting their earlier coverage of my supposed mental illness and issuing corrections that acknowledged the sophisticated criminal conspiracy that had been exposed. Social media platforms began removing the doctored videos that had destroyed my reputation, while new content emerged celebrating my vindication and condemning the institutional failures that had allowed such an elaborate fraud to continue for so long. Daniel's response to his imprisonment was characteristic of the calculating narcissism he had displayed throughout the conspiracy. His few public statements continued to claim that he was the victim of a conspiracy designed to protect the real criminals who had hidden family wealth from its rightful heirs. He remained utterly unable to acknowledge that his entire identity had been fabricated for the purpose of criminal fraud. Betty's fate was perhaps more fitting. The woman who had spent decades building a reputation as a concerned neighbor and community volunteer was now publicly exposed as a career criminal whose entire relationship with our family had been an elaborate fraud. Her social standing, which had been her primary tool for manipulation, was permanently destroyed. Mark's journey from that point was perhaps the most complex aspect of my victory to process. His letters from prison, which began arriving within weeks of his sentencing, revealed a man genuinely struggling to understand how he had become capable of participating in the systematic destruction of his own mother's life. "Mom," he wrote in one particularly painful letter, "I spend every night trying to understand how I convinced myself that protecting our family's financial interests justified helping criminals attack you. The therapists here say that I lost my ability to see you as a person with rights and started seeing you only as an obstacle to maintaining the lifestyle I thought I deserved." His letters revealed someone desperately trying to rebuild his moral foundation from the ground up, questioning everything he had believed about family loyalty, financial security, and the value of truth over convenience. While I read them with the complex emotions of a mother whose son had betrayed her most fundamentally, I could see glimpses of the boy I had raised trying to find his way back to humanity. "I know I can never undo the damage I caused," he continued in another letter, "but I need you to know that I finally understand what we stole from you. It wasn't just your relationship with your grandchildren. It was your right to exist safely in your own community. And I'll spend the rest of my life trying to figure out how to live with that." But it was Sarah's transformation that gave me the greatest hope for our family's healing. My daughter, who had witnessed the full horror of what she had been manipulated into participating in during the trial, chose to face her complicity with genuine courage rather than defensive denial. She came to see me privately just days after the sentencing, without lawyers or mediators, simply a daughter finally ready to confront the full weight of her failures. The woman who entered my modest apartment looked nothing like the confident mother who had once helped spread lies about my fitness as a grandmother. "Mom," she said, her voice breaking before she could say another word, "I failed you in ways that I'm still trying to understand. I let criminals convince me that protecting my children from you was more important than protecting you from them. I chose convenience over courage, and I'll regret that choice for the rest of my life." Her apology wasn't performative or calculated. It was raw and honest, and filled with the kind of genuine remorse that can only come from truly understanding the magnitude of one's failures. She didn't ask for immediate forgiveness or expect instant reconciliation. She simply committed herself to whatever long, difficult process would be required to earn back even a fraction of my trust. "I know I can't undo what we allowed to happen to you," she continued, tears streaming down her face as she spoke. "But I want to spend whatever time we have left proving that I can be the daughter you deserved all along." The grandchildren's journey back to me was perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of the entire ordeal. Michael and Emily, now 12 and 10 respectively, had been devastated by the revelation that they had been manipulated into participating in their grandmother's persecution by people who had never cared about their well-being. Their court-appointed therapist, Dr. Angela Martinez, helped me understand that their participation in the campaign against me had been a form of child abuse, that they had been victims of what experts now called multi-generational manipulation, created by career criminals who had weaponized family relationships for financial gain. When they finally came to see me, they looked like entirely different children. Gone was the confident dismissal they had displayed in their public statements. Instead, they approached me like wounded souls seeking forgiveness they weren't sure they deserved. "Grandma," Michael said, his voice shaking with emotion, "we didn't understand that the bad people were lying to us about you. We thought they told us that you were the one trying to hurt our family, and we believed them because grown-ups aren't supposed to lie about things like that." Emily, struggling with the weight of what she had unknowingly participated in, simply collapsed into my arms and sobbed. "I'm sorry, Grandma. I'm sorry we said those terrible things about you. I want you to teach me how to tell when people are lying, so I never help bad people hurt good people again." Sitting there with my granddaughter in my arms, feeling her genuine tears of remorse, I began to understand something crucial about forgiveness and family healing. These children had been weaponized against me by career criminals who understood exactly how to manipulate family loyalty and parental protection instincts. They were victims just as surely as I had been, and they deserved the chance to heal and grow from this trauma, rather than be defined by it. The victory I had won was complete in legal terms, but the real victory was more complex and more precious. The opportunity to rebuild authentic relationships based on truth instead of manipulation, love instead of fear, genuine connection instead of criminal exploitation. As the months passed, and my family began the slow process of healing from the trauma they had both inflicted and experienced, I realized that justice and healing weren't the same thing. Justice had been served swiftly and completely. Healing would take much longer, but for the first time in over 2 years, it felt genuinely possible. The woman who had spent her career preserving authentic family histories had successfully fought the most important battle of her life, the struggle to expose a criminal conspiracy that had used family love as a weapon, and to create the possibility that future generations might inherit relationships based on truth rather than sophisticated deception designed to serve criminal purposes. 3 years after the trial that vindicated my life and exposed one of the most sophisticated elder abuse conspiracies in federal legal history, I stood in my beautifully restored home, morning sunlight streaming through windows that now opened onto a world where I was free to exist with complete dignity and authentic purpose. My house, which had once felt like a crime scene where my reputation had been systematically murdered, had become a true sanctuary where every photograph, every document, and every memory reflected genuine rather than manipulated history. The physical recovery from my heart attack had been remarkable, aided immeasurably by the end of the psychological warfare that had been slowly killing me. My health had returned to levels that surprised even my doctors, and my energy had been restored in ways that proved how devastating chronic stress and systematic gaslighting could be to even the strongest individuals. But the most profound change wasn't physical. It was the unshakable sense of identity and purpose I had reclaimed after nearly 3 years of living under the shadow of criminal manipulation. I had embraced my role as a survivor and advocate, completely spending months researching the broader patterns of inheritance fraud and elder abuse that my case had helped expose. My experience had revealed that what happened to me wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a growing trend of sophisticated criminals who targeted elderly people with valuable assets using intimate family knowledge and professional credentials to destroy their victims' credibility before systematically exploiting them financially and emotionally. The work I had taken on as an advocate for elder protection and inheritance fraud prevention had become the most meaningful pursuit of my entire life. My unique experience of surviving and exposing such an elaborate conspiracy made me a powerful voice for others who suspected that their family conflicts might involve criminal manipulation rather than legitimate disagreements. I worked closely with Dr. Martinez and my legal team to develop training programs for law enforcement social workers and legal professionals, teaching them to recognize the signs of sophisticated elder abuse that went far beyond physical neglect or obvious financial exploitation. My memoir, When Love Becomes a Weapon, an archivist's journey through family-based criminal conspiracy, had become a bestseller in both the true crime and elder advocacy communities. The book tour took me across the country, speaking to audiences who were hungry for tools to protect themselves and their loved ones from the kind of sophisticated manipulation that had nearly destroyed my life. But the work that brought me the greatest joy was the support group I facilitated for survivors of family-based criminal exploitation. We met weekly in a bright room at the community center, creating a space where people could share their experiences without judgment and find resources for investigating suspicious family dynamics that might involve criminal activity. Evelyn, said Margaret, a 70-year-old woman whose inheritance had been stolen through a sophisticated fraud involving fake family members. You taught me that my instincts about the people claiming to be relatives were right, that I had the right to demand proof of family relationships and question financial arrangements that didn't make sense. You gave me permission to trust my own judgment over other people's manipulation. These moments of connection and mutual empowerment had become the greatest treasure of my later years. Every person who escaped family-based criminal exploitation, every elderly individual who learned to recognize manipulation tactics, every young person who grew up understanding that real family love never requires the sacrifice of personal safety or financial security felt like a victory that honored not just my struggle, but the struggles of countless others who had been victimized by criminals operating within trusted family systems. Sarah's transformation had been as remarkable as my own, though infinitely more difficult to achieve. The daughter, who had once helped criminals destroy her mother's reputation, had spent 3 years proving her commitment to rebuilding our relationship through consistent actions rather than empty promises. Our bond had evolved into something deeper and more authentic than it had ever been, based on complete honesty about the trauma we had both experienced and the manipulation we had both survived. She had become my strongest ally in my elder advocacy work, using her own experience of being manipulated into elder abuse as a teaching tool for other families. "Mom," she said one afternoon as we worked together, preparing materials for a conference on family-based financial crimes, "I keep thinking about how much stronger our relationship is now, that it's built on truth instead of the fear and manipulation that Betty and Daniel used to control us. I wish it hadn't taken something so devastating to teach us how to really trust each other." The grandchildren's healing had been perhaps the most remarkable transformation of all. Michael and Emily, now 15 and 13 respectively, had become passionate advocates for children's rights and the importance of teaching young people to recognize when adults were trying to manipulate them into harmful situations. Michael had decided to study forensic psychology in high school, inspired by Dr. Martinez's work in exposing the criminal conspiracy that had targeted our family. His research project on the psychology of family-based criminal manipulation had been published in a professional journal and was now used in training programs for Child Protective Services workers. "Grandma," he told me during one of our regular Sunday dinners, "everything I know about real courage and integrity, I learned from watching you fight for truth when everyone told you to accept lies. You taught me that love doesn't manipulate, it doesn't deceive, and it never asks you to sacrifice your safety for someone else's convenience." Emily had developed a passion for documentary preservation and was working as a volunteer at the Historical Society, helping to ensure that official records reflected actual historical truth rather than sanitized versions designed to protect criminals or their accomplices. "You saved us twice, Grandma," she told me one evening as we organized evidence for a new training program on recognizing document falsification. First, when we were little and needed protection from people who were pretending to care about us, and then when we were older and needed to learn how to think for ourselves instead of just believing what adults told us was true. Mark's journey continued from the considerable distance that his choices had created between us. His letters from prison had evolved from desperate pleas for forgiveness to thoughtful reflections on the process of rebuilding his moral foundation while serving his sentence for participating in elder abuse. "Mom," he wrote in his most recent letter, "my therapist says that learning to see you as a complete person with rights instead of just my mother who existed to serve our family's financial interests is the hardest work I've ever done. I spent so many years thinking of you only in terms of what you could provide that I forgot you had your own life, your own safety, your own right to exist without being exploited by people claiming to love you." Reading his words, I felt a complex mixture of sadness and hope. This was my son, broken by his own choices and paying the legal consequences for participating in criminal activity, struggling to find redemption from a great distance. I couldn't easily forgive the years of systematic betrayal, but I could hope for his genuine rehabilitation while protecting the peace I had fought so hard to reclaim. Daniel and Betty remained in federal prison, their appeals exhausted, and their criminal conspiracy fully exposed to public scrutiny. Dr. Thompson had died shortly after losing his medical license, carrying his guilt and shame to his grave. Their accomplices had been scattered by prosecution and public exposure, their network of manipulation permanently dismantled. But I felt neither satisfaction nor sadness about their fates, only profound relief that their criminal enterprise had been permanently removed from our community and could never again target vulnerable elderly people or exploit family relationships for financial gain. Standing in my garden each morning, tending flowers that grew strong and beautiful under honest care, I reflected on the unexpected gifts that had emerged from the most difficult period of my life. I had lost my illusions about the automatic trustworthiness of family relationships and community institutions, but I had gained an unshakable understanding of my own worth that no criminal conspiracy could ever take away again. Most importantly, I had learned that survival wasn't enough. True healing required transformation, the kind of growth that turns personal trauma into purposeful action that protects others from similar harm. Like the strongest flowers in my garden, I had discovered that the deepest suffering could produce the most resilient wisdom, and that a life grounded in absolute truth could weather any storm while continuing to nurture authentic growth and genuine connection. The future stretched ahead, uncertain in its details, but grounded in the knowledge that I had faced the most sophisticated criminal manipulation imaginable, and had emerged not just intact, but stronger, wiser, and more committed than ever to the possibility that human beings could learn to love each other without exploitation, manipulation, or the cruel sacrifice of vulnerable family members to criminal greed. Years later, as I sit in my cherished garden, watching my granddaughter Emily present her research on recognizing elder abuse to a conference of law enforcement professionals, I marvel at the extraordinary transformation that can emerge from the deepest betrayal. My home, once a stage for an elaborate criminal conspiracy, now radiates with the warmth of relationships built on truth and mutual protection rather than manipulation and exploitation. The journey from victim to survivor to advocate taught me the most important lesson of my 70 years, that our greatest strength often lies not in trusting blindly, but in courageously confronting deception and fighting for the integrity of our own safety and dignity. I learned that authentic family relationships cannot be built on foundations of manipulation, no matter how sophisticated, and that real love requires the courage to expose criminals even when they claim to be protecting family interests. The scars remain, of course. Mark's betrayal and participation in criminal activity left wounds that may never fully heal, and the knowledge that I was targeted by a sophisticated criminal enterprise changed me in ways that cannot be undone. But those scars have become part of my strength, proof that I survived something designed to destroy my very sense of self, and emerged with my capacity for truth-seeking and family love, not only intact, but expanded in directions I never could have imagined. Today, as I share my story with families and professionals across the nation, I carry a message of hope that transcends the specific details of my experience. Family-based criminal exploitation and inheritance fraud are not rare tragedies that happen to other people. They are growing threats that target our most vulnerable citizens with increasingly sophisticated tactics. But truth will ultimately prevail over even the most elaborate lies. Dignity can be reclaimed even after the most systematic abuse, and a life of purpose and authentic connection is always possible, no matter how late in the journey the healing begins. The woman who spent her career preserving other people's family histories learned that sometimes the most important documentation is the evidence that exposes those who would exploit family love for criminal gain. Like the strongest plants in my garden, I discovered that the deepest roots often grow in the most challenging soil, and that a spirit grounded in absolute honesty can weather any storm while continuing to protect others from similar harm. My legacy now extends far beyond the individual records I maintained during my career as an archivist. It lives in every family that learns to recognize criminal manipulation disguised as concern, every elderly person who finds the courage to question suspicious relatives and financial arrangements, every young person who grows up understanding that real family love never requires the sacrifice of personal safety or dignity. It lives in the knowledge that one woman's refusal to accept criminal exploitation can spark changes that protect countless others from similar harm, and that the simple act of demanding authentic relationships based on truth rather than manipulation can transform not just personal families, but entire communities' understanding of what genuine love and protection really mean.